Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you, Ken?
Exceptionally well. Grateful to be here. We're so grateful that you have tuned in to the Counselling Tutor Podcast to have a listen today. This is episode 192. We've got three topics we're going to be delving into today, starting off with student check-in, where we look at something from a student's journey. And today we're going to be looking at trigger vocabulary of the key theories in counselling. That's going to be an exciting one, no matter what level of study you're at. And in fact, if you're qualified as well, because it's interesting how the key theories of different modalities kind of blend together and become more or less the same thing. We'll be looking at that. Then we go into our brand new slot called Focus on Supervision. And today we're going to be looking at the Supervision Triangle. And then we go into Practice Matters. Practice Matters is where we look into the world of being in practice as a therapist, as a psychotherapist, as a counsellor. And we have a creative arts therapy interview today with Annie Della Prida. Rory did that, and that's a really, really exciting one. You're going to want to stick around for that. But we're going to start off with that student check-in. Rory, the key theory in counselling. I think this is what trips up so many students, the theory, because it can be tricky.
Oh, Ken, yeah, I, even just you talking about that has transferred me back to my student days and having to learn effectively a new language. People, I can remember sitting there in the circle many years ago now, and interjected values came up, and it was like, oh, what's this? What's this? Oh, into conditions of worth, And in my experience, I went on to become a lecturer, and in my experience, I think it's one of the things students really struggle with, understanding the key theory, because it's one thing having it taught in class. It's another thing being able to gather that information to be able to put it into an assignment. And all counselling assignments and all counselling assessments at some level need you to have an understanding of key theory and the terms. And they're just, person-centered therapy has quite a few key terms, but if you go into things like transactional analysis, Gestalt, psychoanalysis or psychodynamic, the work of Freud, they're just term after term after term after term, and it's one thing that students always struggle with. But yet, Ken, you have to have an understanding of those key ideas. You cannot study or practice counselling unless you have a real good understanding of what the term means and how it's applied in reality.
Yeah, and the terms are kind of the vocab or the terms, the wording that is used when you're studying a specific model, and they're usually linked to the theorist, or the theorist may have been inspired by someone else and taken key terms from someone else. But what's interesting is when you look at the different models of counselling, and if you learn one in depth, if you learn, say, person-centered therapy, and you learn all the theory and the key terms, if you look to another modality of therapy, you can find similar things or similar processes, just with different key terms, where they've called it something differently. They explained it differently. And I guess it is different because it's a different theory, but there's a lot of similarity between the different models in terms of the wording is different, yet the meaning, I guess, is the same. And it makes sense, because at the end of the day, what is counselling other than two human beings? If we're just doing one-to-one counselling, two human beings sharing a space with one human being sharing what is going on for them, and the other one listening to that and kind of feeding back and trying to be in service of that person.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And I'll give you some examples of where, different modalities have different names for the same thing. So, if we think of the transactional analysis world and parent, adult, and child, the ego states, you could look at psychoanalytical theory and Freud's idea of the id, the ego, and the superego. They're not precisely the same as you say. They're not precisely the same, but it gives a tripartite view of personality. And the same thing goes for person-centered theory. We talk about conditions of worth and introjected values, and the TA world would talk about drivers and injunctions.
Yep.
So, they are different. I mean, I'm not saying for a minute that actually the theories are actually the same, but actually there's a lot of commonality in theory, and certainly in Gestalt. Gestalt and person-centered therapy share the same roots, which is phenomenology. It's just that Gestalt goes more for body processes, physical processes. Person-centered therapy doesn't work on actual physical responses. Gestalt does. But yeah, it can be really, really confusing. So the two areas of confusion are, first of all, learning the theories, and then realizing that different modalities have the same name for the same kind of theories, and knowing what the difference is.
Yeah.
And and I think there's many a student held a head in the hands through the years trying to articulate that maybe into an assignment.
Yeah. Those dreaded assignments where we have to evidence our understanding of that theory. So what we have for you, we have a super duper Rory handout. And this is a super duper Rory handout called Counselling Theory, Trigger Vocabulary, Cheat Sheet. Now, when we say cheat sheet, it's an honest cheat sheet. All it is, it's a condensation. Is that right? Condensed. If you condense some information, does it become a condensation, Rory? Oh my goodness me!
A condensed. Yeah, we'll own that for the Counselling Tutor podcast.
Yeah.
We do condensation.
It's a condensation document of a different modalities. So we've got the key concepts and principles of person-centered therapy. We then have the key concepts and principles of transactional analysis. We also cover cognitive behavioral therapy and a little bit of Gestalt in there as well. So I'm just going to kick us off for 10 points. That's a saying that I've heard somewhere in my life. I don't really know what it means, but it sounds good, so I'll pop it in here. When we're looking at the key concepts of person-centered therapy, these are not the only concepts. These are the key concepts. So this is not the in-depth, all that one needs to know about person-centered therapy. But we've got the 6 conditions for therapeutic change. We've got the 7 stages of process. We've got the 19 propositions, the dreaded 19 propositions, I have to say here.
Indeed, Ken.
We've got locus of evaluation. We've got use of the word the organismic self, conditions of worth, introjected values, and then we throw phenomenology in there just for good measure. Now, every one of those words, or those key principles that I've just mentioned there, within this document that we have for you, you can click on it and it will take you to an in-depth description. So all of them are linked. So if I was to click on the 6 conditions for therapeutic change, that's going to take me through to an article on the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions. So you've got the key terminology, which takes you through to an in-depth article that's going to give you a bit more. So I've done person-centered therapy, Rory. Are you okay to go into transactional analysis for us?
Yes, absolutely, Ken. So transactional analysis starts with ego states, and there's the functional and the structural model. So the structural model is parent, adult, and child, and the functional model is how, as a person goes through their day, they live in one of those ego states. So you could start off as an adult, and then you could get really grumpy if somebody cuts you up on the way to work, if you indeed now travel to work in a car. And you could say, oh, you're a terrible driver, and you could end up sounding like your father or your mother. And then you might stop off and get a coffee on the way and get really excited, and you become very childish and think, I'm going to have an extra marshmallow on my latte or whatever they have in coffee houses. I'm not quite sure. I drink tea myself. And then we talk about injunctions and drivers. So an injunction is something that you were told as a child. And then the driver is something that kind of pushes you away from that. So you might be told as a child, don't be well, you're always ill. And the driver may be, I've got to keep fit all the time. And there are a number of injunctions and drivers. I have to say, TA is more theoretically dense than person-centered. Then you have life scripts, stories you create in childhood that then you go on to live out in adulthood. And then you have things like racket feelings, and then you can go on to more advanced ideas of transactional analysis, things like the Cartman drama triangle. So there's quite a few bits of theory there, isn't there, that you have to get a grip of. And of course, the thing is that usually you'd study one model, and then you go on to do a comparative model. You compare them. So you wouldn't have to know all the theory in great depth. However, you need to be able to compare them to the core model. Indeed.
And everything Rory's just covered there again is in this handout. You can get the handout by going to counsellingtutor.com. That is our website. At the very top of the page, just look for the podcast tab because you're listening to a podcast, and find episode 192. That's today's episode. And right there in that page, you'll be able to download this key theory, trigger vocab, sheet with all the links in. We also cover in there cognitive behavioral therapy, where we'll look at core beliefs, dysfunctional assumptions, negative automatic thoughts, and a little bit of Gestalt throw in there as well. Deflection, introjection, projection, confluence. Even reading the words, Rory, are pretty tricky because I didn't study Gestalt.
Confluence.
Yeah. Confluence. So there's a lot there. There's a lot in this, and we really hope that if you are a student that on a study journey, or even if you've qualified, it's good to have this on hand, because it's one sheet that has so many links to the key theories, so you've got it on hand. I think very, very useful indeed, and you can pick that up. Again, counsellingtutor.com is where you go, podcast tab, episode 192, go and get your copy.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And at the top of the podcast, you did say that it's a cheat sheet. It's more like a mini thesaurus.
It really is, isn't it? Yeah, it's a good reference sheet, that's for sure, especially if you're doing an assignment. And I know, we're making this real time at the moment. We are going into, we're in the thick of assignment season right now. So maybe useful to you. So there's our student check-in. Hope that was useful for you. Now for our brand new section where we focus on supervision, where today we're going to be speaking about the supervision triangle.
Focus on supervision.
Yes, anyone who's done any form of supervisory training will be familiar with the supervisory triangle. And the supervisory triangle is a very simple graphic you can write on a piece of paper to show the different positions that supervisors may take within a supervisory session. And it's normative, formative, and restorative. And basically that means the normative is really about normalizing things. It might be about paperwork, could be about insurance, could be about just a general chat about ethics. So you might get a supervisee who comes in and they want to talk about, I need to upgrade my insurance. I need to look at my insurance policy. I'm not sure I have one, in which case a supervisor would start to work with that. And then you go to the formative end of the triangle, and the formative end of the triangle is really about theoretical information and craft and knowledge. The idea of seeing a supervisor is that you are a little further on down the line. Your supervisor's further on down the line than you are, and they have more practice experience. They may have a speciality area that they work in. Could be young people, could be trauma-informed practice, could be sexuality. There's a whole plethora of different disciplines within counselling, specialities. And it may be that you come along and you say, I've got a client who seems to be having flashbacks. How do I work with that? And the formative area is in information, really helping the student to gain resources or gain an understanding. So I can remember in my very, very early practice, I went to see my supervisor about a number of clients who presented with trauma, and she said, well, what do you know about trauma? And I knew very little because it wasn't taught on my course. So she gave me some information, and then curiously, when I came back the next time, she said, "Okay, tell me about the information." So she acted as a teacher. How have you applied that in your therapeutic practice? What did you learn? And then eventually you get to another part of the triangle, which is restorative. And the restorative is where, or restorative is probably a better pronunciation of it, restorative. And that is when you come in to the supervision, the supervisor says, "How are things?" And you go, "Oh, I'm feeling really de-skilled. The client hasn't moved on. I'm feeling that I'm not helping the client." So there's some kind of emotional underpin there to kind of support the therapist. And the curious thing, Ken, is that you can come into those corners of the triangle like doors. So I could go in and think, I really need some information on working with the client's sexuality. So I open that door, and the supervisor works with that. But through the journey along that kind of passage of learning and gaining information, it may be I say, I'm really, really struggling trying to understand the client's frame of reference. So we could take a slight detour into the restorative side of things. We could go in one entry and come out another exit. So it's a living. The triangle is a representation of a living process within supervision, and the supervisor's job is to listen very, very closely to the supervisee and apply any one of those 3 points of the triangle as a starting point for supervision.
Yeah, it's so handy because you have this triangle that kind of underpins anything that is brought into supervision. And if you're a clinical supervisor, you're already going to know about the supervision triangle. But if you're a counsellor and you haven't done supervision training, then it's good to have this information. You can kind of look and see when you're going into your sessions, where is the information you're bringing? How is that being kind of mapped in this triangle? As you say, Rory, formative, it's kind of almost like informing the practice of the supervisee, maybe providing information, guidance. It might be brushing up on some theory work there. The normative side, where it's almost, I guess, Rory, like a soft managerial role.
Yeah,
that normative, where you kind of helping out. You might say to someone, when last did you look at the BACP or whatever their ethical body is? When last did you have a look at that ethical framework? And then, of course, restorative, you're looking after the supervisee themselves. Who are they within the relationship? What are they carrying? And in restorative, it may be elements that stand outside of the client-counsellor relationship as well. It may be something that the counsellor is experiencing their own life, if they're going through a divorce, if they've had a recent loss. It may be looked at in restorative, and that restorative area will not go into being deeply therapeutic. If the supervisor picks up that the counsellor is carrying a lot, they may suggest that the counsellor goes and sees their own therapist, so that there isn't that role confusion. But that falls right there into that restorative corner of the triangle.
Yeah, one final thing about the triangle, right in the middle of it, is ethics. So as we walk down those little passageways, we open the door of formative and we're walking down. That corridor is really heading towards ethics. So right in the middle of that triangle is ethics, and the supervisor has ethics right at the forefront of the mind. No matter which points of those triangle you enter, they're thinking ethics. And what I would say from experience is that, I've had the privilege of supervising a lot of students through the years, and I love supervising students, and you find yourself as a supervisor in right at the beginning in the formative area, because as a supervisor, what you're doing is you're checking their level of knowledge, so that you can be confident that they can be ethical enough to practice. So if you're going into supervision for the first time, don't be surprised if your supervisor asks you some quite direct questions about what's your modality, what do you understand of your modality, may ask you some questions on confidentiality, may ask you some questions on, have you got your insurance, have you got ethical body membership? And And what they're doing is not only testing your level of knowledge, but also looking at the ethical side. Now, if you're going into the restorative part of the triangle, what the supervisor is thinking is obviously wanting to support you, as Ken said, maybe directing you to your own therapy, because supervision isn't therapy. Supervision is therefore in the service of the client. But what the supervisor will be thinking in their mind is this person okay to practice? So they won't be saying, oh, this person is not okay to practice, but they'll be listening very carefully. They may say, and as I've said, and I've had said to me in the past, why don't you just take it a little bit easy? Don't take any more clients on. You've obviously got things going on for you. And an example of that would be halfway through my training, my mother died, and I went to my supervisor, and my supervisor said, oh, okay, Rory, well, you sound like you're okay to practice. Just be thoughtful. Don't take any more clients on. Just be thoughtful of who you get referred. If it's a bereavement, be thoughtful. Are you okay? Are you robust enough to be able to work with that without your own stuff getting in the way? So ethics is really at the heart of the triangle. So if you were to draw it, formative, normative, restorative, right in the middle is ethics. And sometimes it's an unseen triangle. I wonder there'd be people listening to this thinking, that's why my supervisor asked me that.
Very, very much so. And we have just finished building, Rory has just finished building a level 6 certificate in clinical supervision, which is offered by Counselling Tutor. It is a course that you do online with live tutor-led sessions. You'll be working in groups. You'll be observed within those groups. You're really held through that. It's a 3-month course. If you're interested in becoming a supervisor, then go to counsellingtutor.com. All of the information can be gained there. And you've put a lot of yourself into that, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. I've put in my practice experience. I've been a supervisor for a number of years, and also I've spent a lot of time holed up in counselling towers, reading all the theory, revisiting the theory, revisiting new theories of supervision, and crucially, making sure that the course itself covers online supervision, because that has now become an absolute must-have. If you're a supervisor and you're supervising anybody who uses either they're online permanently, or they're in a mixed economy of practice, some face-to-face in the room, some online, then you really, really do have to have online competencies. And I've mapped the course to that. So when someone graduates it, they can be confident they can work face-to-face in the room and also online as well.
So if you're interested in finding out more information on the Level 6 Certificate in Clinical Supervision, just go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is there. We now back out of focus on supervision into practice matters. Rory, you met up with Annie Della Prida and to speak about creative arts therapy.
Absolutely. It's something that comes up a lot in our Facebook group. And if you don't know our Facebook group, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. We're a closed group, but knock on the door. Of course, we're going to let you in. And it comes up time and time again, working creatively with arts in therapy. And I caught up with Annie Della Prida. We had a wonderful conversation regarding creative arts and the lecture she gave for the CPD library. And this is what she had to say.
Practice matters.
And we welcome Annie Della Prida, who's the founder of Person-Centred Creative Arts and lecturer at the University of East London. Welcome, Annie.
Hello, Rory. I'm really, really excited to be here.
Thank you. And you've recently produced a lecture for us on creative arts in therapy for our Counsellors CPD library. I wonder what people need to know about creative arts.
I think one of the first things to know and to understand is to look at defining the difference between person-centred art therapy and using creative arts in a counselling setting. So to just talk a little bit about that and some of the restrictions on protected titles and things like that. That's one of the main things. But I also really want to show how creative arts can really enhance therapeutic effectiveness. I think sometimes people get the idea that using arts is something quite light and fluffy and a bit of fun, but actually there's a huge depth. It almost instantly promotes relational depth with clients. That's really very important. But linked to that then is also the importance that I think we need to have a more enhanced sensitivity, because there's also an increased danger of harm to clients. So I very much promote a non-directive way of working, which was founded or developed by Liesl Silverstone, who is the founder of this way of working. The work that we do and the approach we use it's similar to Natalie Rogers, but it's one of the tribes, if you like, or branches of the person-centred approach. But there are some differences, which I also talk about and would like to explain and show that. I'll also be sharing a simple exercise and showing how you can safely use that, even without any specific training or experience, that any counsellor can use that. And I will be showing the dangers of being directive so that people can understand why it's important to be not directive. I do like to, rather than tell, I do like to show. So there'll be lots of images as well that I'll be sharing. And I also share a case study example, because I think it's really important. And I know when I read things or if I look at work, I like to see what it looks like in practice. I like to understand, because we're all practitioners, aren't we? And that's what we're really interested in, is the difference it makes and what it looks like when you use it with people.
Absolutely. And I'm really struck what you say about using the approach to enhance relational depth. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, relational depth, when working with creative arts, is actually, for a lot of people who come on my training courses, I'm very surprised how quickly it works. It enhances relational depth because more of the person is available to be empathised with as soon as you start to use image work. And that's something that I'll sort of demonstrate almost instantly. And it's really linked to working with metaphor.
Absolutely. And it sounds to me, I heard you say that there's more to work with. Is there any specific clients that would benefit more from working in this way than perhaps clients who may just prefer what I would call just talk therapy? I guess what I'm trying to say is it useful for some clients' presentations where talking may not be as easy as using an art form to describe what's going on, and you do use the term metaphoric or metaphor?
Very much so. I think it's helpful to not differentiate too much between talking therapy or not talking, because often in a session you'll use both talking and working with art. They're not so necessarily distinct. Well, they are distinct, but hopefully they can be combined, I think is what I'm saying. But very much so. For example, particularly with clients who've experienced trauma, it can be very difficult to talk about. It can be really hard to find the right words. So working with creative arts or visual imagery can be really helpful, partly also because sometimes traumatic experiences are stored in parts of the brain that are non-verbal, and so processing them can only be done in non-verbal ways. So there's that sort of category of clients, if you like. But also for clients who are, let's say they have things they don't know about themselves, they want to work a little more with their subconscious or unconscious. Because when you do an image, it's almost like an undifferentiated or a part of the inner world is photographed and put on paper to work with. So more of the client is on paper, if you like, to work with than when somebody's talking. So that's another category of client. I often find with younger clients, particularly teenagers who sometimes can find it difficult to talk, they particularly like to work with art. And also people who are cognitively very bright or very analytical with a very strong left brain can find it really helpful, actually, to switch into a right brain mode. So, but pretty much everyone, in my experience, Rory, really can benefit from working with art.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that it's an interesting perspective for someone who is trained as a Rogerian therapist to talk about that kind of voyage into the subconscious, because traditional Rogerian work, of course, is edge of awareness. But it sounds to me that this could access parts of the client that maybe the client wasn't aware of, and bring it into awareness.
Absolutely, but that's why a person-centred approach is so vitally important, because it does deal with edge of awareness, but it also deals with material that is totally out of awareness. If you can create an environment that is free from judgment and interpretation, a client may feel safe enough to recognise that material and to own it and to acknowledge it, integrate it, but they may not. But that's the key. The key is to be able to facilitate in a way that is non-interpretive, non-judgmental, and non-directive. And more so than with words, because when you use words, you're able to filter and to defend yourself verbally. You don't have to say what you don't want to say. When you're working with an image, it's on paper and you don't know what it represents. So there's an extra layer of sensitivity and carefulness that's needed in a therapist. But I'll also talk a little bit about the difference between art as therapy and art in therapy when counselling. Because there is an element of just the doing of it is beneficial to mental health, and the doing of it can be therapeutic. But there are also specific skills you can use for facilitation, and that's really highlights also the dangers and the need for non-directivity, in my view.
Yes, and I think you make an interesting point. Although the work may touch on the subconscious process, it's the lack of interpretation and the lack of directiveness that still falls very, very firmly into the person-centered canon. Very,
absolutely.
So I wonder, you talked a little bit about it's useful for young people. Can you expand on that? How is it useful maybe for young people who may be struggling to kind of articulate themselves?
I think sometimes I'm thinking in particular of working with teenagers who can be at that stage where they find it a little bit uncomfortable, or they don't quite know what to say, or they find it difficult to talk to a therapist. And when we work with images, I find they are incredibly insightful, and that comes through in an image because we're able to work. They can do an image without too much thought or self-consciousness, and then when we explore it together, actually they discover how insightful they are, and it's an incredibly empowering way of working for them too. And the amount of material that comes out in one session, 2 sessions, is 10 times what would come from just a verbal talking session.
Yes. Yes, I'm a former school counsellor, and I can attest to the power of imagery when working with young people, because they can express sometimes what they cannot articulate.
Yes, absolutely. And also sometimes they can express what they don't even know they know. Yes. That makes sense?
Yes.
And that's incredibly empowering for them.
Well, Annie, I have to say it's been really interesting talking with you today. I'm fascinated about the creative arts side of counselling, because I think it was Carl Rogers who said of his daughter, it's ploughing new ground, and I really believe that this is the plough of new ground. It brings a whole new aspect, certainly, to the person-centered way of working. And I wonder, right at the end of this interview, what do you hope that those who watch your lecture will take away? What's your hope for that?
I hope that they really get to see and understand how important this way of working is. Carl Rogers was actually the course supervisor with Lisa when he said that of the course, that it was ploughing new ground. And I think I'm very mindful. I don't want this way of working to be lost or misunderstood. So I hope that people come away with, and maybe that I ignite some passion in people for this way of working.
Well, I think that's a really strong call to action. I think our profession is all about passion. It should be somewhere at the heart of what we do. So Annie de la Prida, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Rory. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Annie de la Prida. and to you, Rory, for hosting that interview.
Yes, well, it was an absolute pleasure, and such an interesting aspect of counselling, and one that is, I think, is a growing edge. But what an episode! We started off with the key theory in counselling, talking about the new language that students have to learn when they enter the wonderful world of counselling and psychotherapy. We moved on to focus on supervision, where we spoke about the supervision triangle and the many directions supervision might take depending on what you present. And then finally, we met up with the wonderful Annie De La Prida, who talks about creative arts in therapy. And as always, stay grounded, stay safe, and hey, join the digital counselling revolution.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counsellor CPD Library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counsellor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counselor CPD Library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.